Now, who knows what book ends with these words? Away, alone, alas, alas, loved along the. Sound familiar to anyone?
Is that the last one?
Yeah.
Huh?
I could.
The words are away, alone, alas, loved along the. Along the. Okay. Okay. Well, the sentence begins. That's the middle of a sentence. I'm sorry. That's the beginning of a sentence, but the sentence ends, and it isn't at the end of the book, but it ends. River run past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. And he hints there. Okay, well, this is the beginning and the end of Finnegans Wake, okay, by James Joyce. And I have to admit, I've never read Finnegans Wake. I read about 10 pages of it one time, and talk about Dr. Jung's work bouncing off of it. Finnegans Wake is extremely dense, at least at the beginning. I think that later on it sort of gets a flow to it. But the point of Finnegans Wake was that it was the round of life. And so he was describing the circulation of the River Liffey around Dublin, which brings both water to the city of Dublin, but also takes out the refuse. And then it recirculates back. It comes back as rain and comes through again. And so James Joyce, or I'm sorry, Joseph Campbell got so into Finnegans Wake, because it's so deep, that he wrote a book called The Skeleton Key to Finnegans Wake, which is about 200 pages long, and it's that book I did read, and he describes like the 8 layers of Finnegans Wake, which the point of it is that we're all very complex, and the things that we think about are very complex, and they're always coming back to us. And so it's part of nature that it's the round of life and so on, but somehow if we're going to survive as a species, we're going to have some further transformation in our way of thinking about the world. All of us, not only Americans, but every human being on the planet. Because, in the old days, it used to be just the guy who owned the castle next door that you'd fight with. But nowadays, we have the means to destroy the world. And, we actually have a presidential candidate that says, why don't we use nuclear weapons? And so we, yeah. And so anyway, so James Joyce was kind of irrational in the way he wrote. He was asked at one point why he wrote Finnegans Wake the way he did so densely. And his answer was to keep critics clucking for 300 years. And his previous book was Ulysses. Have you read Ulysses? And are you familiar with Molly Bloom's soliloquy?
Yes.
Okay. Well, if you're not familiar with Molly Bloom's soliloquy, make a note of it, Molly Bloom's soliloquy, and look it up on YouTube, because there are several excellent performances of Molly Bloom's soliloquy by different Irish actresses, especially, and they're just terrific at it. And there's nice visuals that go with it on YouTube. But Ulysses is a very frustrating book because it doesn't just explain, this, then this, then this, then this, and so you think you're into something logical because it's just stream of consciousness, the way we actually are. Um, and um, and so Dr. Jung was asked to write a critique of it, a psychological critique of it, and he bounced off of it for 3 years, and ultimately he put himself into the mindset of James Joyce. And he knew James Joyce personally because Joyce had come to Dr. Jung about the schizophrenia of his daughter, who actually was a schizophrenic. But he put himself into the mindset, and then he wrote a 25-page critique, which, if you read it, it's in volume 15 of the collected works, which is about art and literature and poetry. And I probably should put that in the Dropbox, which I will, in the collected works. So volume 15, and in that is Dr. Jung's critique of Ulysses. And the amusing thing, there's a couple of amusing things. One, the publishers were sort of afraid to publish it. And they wrote to Joyce and said, well, what do you think about this? And Joyce said, hang it low, which in his vernacular meant make it conspicuous. And it was based on something that one of the Habsburg emperors or somebody had said, where he was criticized for something, and he said, well, hang it low so everybody can read this criticism of me, basically. So Joyce was saying, hang it low, make sure you publish it. And there's a cover letter that Dr. Jung wrote to James Joyce when he completed this critique. And in this cover letter, he says about Molly Bloom's soliloquy, well, maybe the devil's grandmother knew so much about a woman, but I didn't. and so I'll be interested to hear what any of you women think of what James Joyce knew about women when he wrote it. Do you have a thought about it? You no? Okay. Well, I urge you to take a look at it. Okay, so we're this rational world, and everybody, I think, thinks that mathematics is rational. Can anybody define calculus for me? Do you know what calculus is?
I avoided knowing that.
Pardon?
I avoided knowing that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to explain it to.
Approximation, right?
Pardon?
It's an approximation method. You start with coarse rectangles and you reduce the size until you have the sum of all the tiny rectangles. So it's an approximation of an area or.
Oh, well, okay, that it could do that. Yes, it could do that. Calculus is the definition of a point on a curved line in hyperspace. Okay, and if I give you an L-shaped graph, and I say, do you want apples or oranges? And I have a certain number of apples and a certain number of oranges, we could graph where the class would be in terms of how many apples people would exchange for oranges. If I add bananas to that, I can make the graph three-dimensional. And so then we could graph and predict, theoretically, statistically, we could predict how many apples, how many oranges, and how many bunches of bananas we would need. But then if we add grapes, now we can no longer graph it. Okay, if we add grapes, we can no longer graph it because there's a fourth dimension, and we don't have four dimensions to graph, but calculus does that. And so when you hear about algorithms on Wall Street, those are all calculus. Those are all models built on trade-offs between this and that, thrown into an equation that ultimately a computer can crunch down on and predict what the next thing is going to be, whether we're going to have apples tomorrow at the opening of Wall Street or whether it's going to be grapes, or sour grapes. But for all the rationality, it's irrational because because statistics is always based on an average. It's not based on something absolute. But the flaw is that, okay, a chessboard has eight squares in each direction and 32 pieces, 16 pieces on each side. And if you do a permutation about how many possible moves there are on a chessboard, it comes out to a couple billion, I think, is the number of possible moves that you could make on a chessboard. But the problem is that people tend to wiggle a little bit more than chess pieces, okay? And we have a broader range than the squares on a chessboard. And so that's the irrational part. That's the part that mathematics and the rational can never teach us or never know. Okay? And so when Dr. Jung was talking about the psyche, he's trying to tell us about something that until his death, until the time of his death, we basically were ignoring or downplaying, and we need to think about it a lot. Another way of thinking about it, in this piece, he mentions the microscope. And if a child or a teenager maybe looks at a microscope, through a microscope, they will see something, but they will have no clue what it is. They'll say, oh, that's an interesting picture, or oh, I see something moving there. But if a pathologist looks through a microscope, they can tell what kind of disease is there, or what cancer is present, and so the point is that the psyche is also a tool, okay, and it's a tool that you need to be able to understand what the meanings are. And what Dr. Jung taught, one of his fundamental teachings, is all of our thinking is in images in some sense. What Dr. Jung says in this piece is, if you're not used to looking, if you're not trained as a pathologist is to look at through a microscope, if you're not trained in what the images mean, then you're not can't possibly understand what it means.